We are here for a philosophy lecture. We're getting into 20th century philosophy, and one of the key trends in 20th century philosophy is analytic philosophy, sometimes also thought of in terms of linguistic philosophy. They're not exactly the same thing, but they're very directly related fields. I'd like to give sort of an overview of the 20th century analytic and linguistic philosophers, more or less using Donald Palmer's treatment in that textbook as a guide, and just kind of give a summary of the developments in 20th century thought in that mode. We'll look first at the analytic tradition and some of the early minds in that tradition, one of which was G.E. Moore, who was a student at Cambridge, one of the British universities. And a kind of a weird thing had happened by the time Moore and some of his colleagues in the early 20th century were at Cambridge and Oxford. The British had somehow gotten hooked on Hegel. If you remember our discussions of Hegelian thought on the continent from the previous century, where you had this grand metaphysical system and an understanding of the absolute spirit guiding and working through everything that is happening in our history in a process of becoming, and everything is very much in this spiritual mode, this metaphysical mode. That's not typical of British philosophy generally, but somehow in the early 20th century the British universities had sort of become steeped in Hegel, and everybody was teaching Hegel. Moore was actually not a philosophy student. He was majoring in classical literature at Cambridge, but a part of that was studying the classics, so they would read some of the great philosophers' works from the ancient period. And Moore took a strong distaste to a lot of this philosophical mumbo-jumbo, not only in the ancient Greeks like Plato, but also what was being taught then by the philosophy department about Hegel and some of that thought. And along with a fellow student of his by the name of Bertrand Russell, who would become a big name in this analytic movement as well, they sort of began a revolution or a rebellion against this metaphysical branch of philosophy. Later on, Bertrand Russell would say about G.E. Moore, he took the lead in the rebellion, and I followed with a sense of emancipation. Bradley, and that was one of these professors, actually an Oxford professor who was big into Hegelian thought. Bradley argued that everything common sense believes is mere appearance. We reverted to the opposite extreme and thought that everything is real that common sense, uninfluenced by philosophy or theology, supposes real. With a sense of escaping from prison, we allowed ourselves to think that the grass is green, that the sun and stars would exist even if there was no one there to observe them. And that line might make you reminiscent of some things George Berkeley had said, where he had thought of all of our experiences being merely perception, that there was no physical reality at all and everything was just a thought and was guided by the thoughts of God. Well, Moore and now Russell along with him are reacting very strongly against those rather speculative philosophical traditions. Let's get back down to common sense was Moore's agenda. And so G.E. Moore became very much the philosopher of common sense. In fact, probably his most famous treatise was an essay entitled In Defense of Common Sense. There's an excerpt from that in the John Cottingham anthology, Western Philosophy. Copies of that you've been using. We have them on the reserve shelf here in the library. In that essay, G.E. Moore just kind of lays out a number of things that he says, these are things I know and anybody with any common sense knows. For instance, I know I have a body. And I know that my body was once smaller than it is now. And I know that my body has been in contact with the Earth's surface. In other words, my feet are on the ground. I know that my body has been and is at various distance from other bodies and things in the world around me. I know that the Earth has existed for many years before I was here upon it. I know that many other human bodies have existed here on the Earth. This is the kind of stuff he's writing. Clearly, this is not speculative philosophy. This is just, here's what really is. And if it sounds boring, if it sounds mundane, that's because in Moore's opinion, truth is mundane. Truth is earthbound and basic, and you ought to just be able to know it when you see it. And you don't have to have these grand philosophical explanations for things. My PowerPoint illustration has Michael Moore, not G.E. Moore at this point. If you know Michael Moore, the documentary filmmaker, he's always in search of truth as he sees it, I suppose. You may not agree with his political perspective or his concept of truth. But there's no relation between G.E. Moore and Michael Moore. It's not like there's family lines. But there's a sort of a connection in the notion that they're both very strongly in pursuit of what they think is commonsensical and what people ought to know, and on the basis of that, what people ought to do. One of G.E. Moore's students, when he became a professor himself and was a friend of his through life, was John Maynard Keynes, who became famous economist. We talk of Keynesian economics. And Keynes said of G.E. Moore that the most frequent phrase you would hear out of his lips was, "What exactly do you mean?" He was always concerned with the meaning of our phrases, the meaning of our words. As a common sense philosopher, he was basically interested in the common meaning of common language and making sure that we're clear in our communication with one another. And so with Moore, not only do you see this turn in 20th century thought toward a very strongly analytical approach, let's look at things in a clear, resolute way where we can make sense of things in a physical world, but also this turn towards language, which would be a very dominant theme in 20th century philosophy. It was the linguistic turn, some say, where philosophers became very deeply concerned with how language functions and how we arrive at meaning in our communications one with another. Bertrand Russell, I mentioned as a colleague or a student of, along with G.E. Moore at Cambridge. Bertrand Russell, cut from somewhat of a different cloth than Moore. He was from British royal or nobility heritage. He actually inherited an earldom himself. His grandfather had been one of the British prime ministers along the way. And Moore and Russell, college companions, kind of went in different directions with their careers from there. Moore was not a mathematician. He was not a scientist. He was more just interested in understanding common sense and language. Russell was deeply a mathematician and a scientist. In fact, one of his most famous works, co-written with Alfred North Whitehead, Principia Mathematica, the Principles of Mathematics, a voluminous work that I don't even dare try to read. You have to be a high-level mathematical and logical mind to follow where they're going. But basically, they're setting out in that book the understanding that all mathematics, all arithmetic functions are basically functions of logic. And that's what they're setting out to prove in this major work, that math equals logic and logic equals mathematics. Moore was just as hard-nosed and analytical and pushing for true scientific answers to things in his philosophical work as Moore had been. In fact, more so, and he became by far the more famous of these analytical philosophers. Science, in the eyes of someone like Bertrand Russell, is innocent unless proven guilty, while philosophy is guilty unless proven innocent. That's kind of an old catch saying about guys like Bertrand Russell and some of this analytic brand of philosopher. They're very much scientists who are thinking philosophically, more so than philosophers in the sense that we typically think of them. Russell wrote all kinds of things. In fact, some of his critics used to say that he would write a book every year, and each one refuting the one that he wrote the previous year. His positions tended to move and shift as he continued his work, but he was just prolific. And a number of the works that he wrote continue to be widely read. His own autobiography in 3 volumes he wrote a history of philosophy, a multi-volume set there as well. And in addition to his philosophical work, also was a social critic, and got involved in activism, protest movements. One of the people very much active in protesting nuclear weapons, for instance, during the era of nuclear proliferation. So even though he's very much a hard-nosed philosophical, scientific mind, he's also socially active, wrote works on education, how he thought children should be raised, things of that nature. And maybe above it all, through it all, just kind of the reminder thought that Russell was very much committed to what we learned as Occam's razor, the principle that you always simplify. You cut things down to the simplest possible explanation. That's the best explanation. Now, if we move away from those British figures that were doing analytic philosophy, another place where you see this analytic trend in 20th century thought is also over on the continent, where there was a group that got started known as the logical positivists. That's what they called themselves. This originated in Vienna, started with a professor there named Moritz Schlick, who was giving philosophy of science lectures, and a cadre of thinkers gathered around Schlick and referred to themselves as the Vienna Circle. Otto Neurath, Hans Reichenbach, A.J. Ayer, Rudolf Carnap, they're all into this same mode of analytic thought. When they say positivism, as in the logical positivists, they mean positive proof, scientific proof of the propositions that we are claiming. And so they're returning to this mode of trying to prove all things, not in a philosophical, argumentative way, but in a pure scientific way, and that will be the focus of their work. They were dispersed from Vienna. They were not at all popular with the Nazis, nor were the Nazis popular with them, and so they pretty much had to get out of Vienna during the 1930s as the Nazi regime came to power. And that had something to do with their movement taking a wider, or having a wider impact, because they ended up at various universities in Britain, in America, and because they were spread here and there, their various perspectives were spreading through various university campuses as well. You see a quote from Rudolf Carnap that I've labeled "skewering with a familiar fork." That fork is the fork we saw from David Hume. Hume's fork, that all statements have to be on one or the other prong of that fork. Either it's an analytic statement that's true in and of itself on the face of the terms in the statement, something like all bachelors are unmarried, or it's synthetic. In other words, you put the proof together, or you put the evidence together, and you find out if the statement is true. We used the very simple statement, "the cat is on the mat," as a sample of a synthetic statement. You go and look, is the cat on the mat? Aha, yes, it's true. If it wasn't one of those two kinds of truths, according to the logical positivists, it had no meaning. Logical analysis yields the negative result that the alleged statements in the domain of metaphysics are entirely meaningless, Carnap said. And that was their way of reviving and giving new emphasis to Hume's fork. That was going to be the mantra of their scientific approach. If you look at what they do then as they analyze the fields of knowledge, you see that really the only place where there is representative function for language, in other words, that a statement in language actually represents a truth to be told, is when you're talking about the sciences, physics, biology, chemistry, even perhaps psychology, as long as we understand that as the science of the brain and understanding how the human brain works. When you move into other subjects that are not cold clinical scientific subjects, then they would say that's just expressive language. whether it's in the arts, as you would have in drama or poetry, or, in their mind, in philosophy. The metaphysics of Plato or Hegel or somebody like that would fit into this category of really poetic sort of language. Or they would classify religion the same way. It's perfectly fine if you want to make religious statements, if you want to have religious beliefs, but understand that those have the same truth value as art and poetry and music. They're not statements of truth in any genuine scientific way, they're just expressive feelings. The verifiability principle that the logical positivists used was summarized by A.J. Ayer, and incidentally, A.J. Ayer's language, truth, and logic probably is the nicest, tight, concise treatment of what the logical positivist agenda was about. Ayer said, "The criterion which we use to test the genuineness of apparent statements of fact is the criterion of verifiability. We say that a sentence is factually significant to any given person if, and only if, he knows how to verify the proposition which it purports to express. That is, he knows what observations would lead him, under certain conditions, to accept the proposition as true or reject it as being false." And we had talked about this when we talked about Hume's fork back in the Enlightenment era philosophers. What Ayer is basically saying is that any sort of statement that could be scientifically verified is a valid sort of statement. Even if we don't have the data or the means just at our fingertips right now to verify it, we at least could conceive of doing so. So if I said there is intelligent life on planets outside of our galaxy, that would qualify as a potentially truth-bearing statement, because given the right circumstances with probes or research into deep space, we could go out and test that statement. We could find evidence, gather data, and determine whether the statement is true or false. On the other hand, when you make a statement such as, God is loving, these logical positivists would say, well, that sort of statement really carries no validity or meaning. There's no way to test it. There's no way to prove it. It's just poetic, expressive talk, but there's nothing scientific or true behind it. The logical positivists had sort of a heyday, but also somewhat fell apart. It was a somewhat short-lived movement because they couldn't succeed in many of their main aims. One of which was to give clear expression to how language works. Again, with all these 20th century philosophers, we're working on how does language work. And the logical positivists had the idea of trying to describe what exactly was happening when language is expressed and to pare it down to its most basic elements. Well, they kept doing that and kept doing that to the point that you really reach a state where you can't communicate anything at all in words. For instance, if I pick up the book and say, this is a pale yellow book that I'm holding in my hands. That sounds like a simple statement, but it's actually rather complex. What does pale mean to you? What does pale mean to me? That may have different shades in our own understandings of the term. What is yellow? How do you describe in a dictionary definition, in a scientific definition, the name of a color or the reality of a color? And so what you finally get down to in the logical positivist way of saying the simplest form of language is the only way I can communicate with you is to say, and I'm trying to tell you what this is by pointing and grunting, because I can't really use words to express it because the words are going to be lost between us somehow. So they had their theory of language had problems. Their attempt to build that theory of language into something that all scientists would use was rejected by most of the scientific community. They had this dream that all the sciences would use a common language, whether you were doing biology, chemistry, physics, whatever, that everybody would adopt the same basic scientific terminology and make use of it across all the sciences in the same meanings all the time. Well, there was no rational scientist that wanted to play that game with them and pretty much rejected it. It was also during this period that Thomas Kuhn's book on the structure of scientific revolutions came out and pretty much shot holes in a lot of the thoughts and theories that the logical positivists had been raising. Another area in which the logical positivist theory was weak and people felt it to be weak was their theory on morals or ethics. Somewhat like their theory on language, it became a matter of, in a sense, pointing and grunting. There was no rational or scientific basis for moral laws. A statement like stealing is wrong in the eyes of the logical positivists was not a verifiable statement that you could prove scientifically. It was really an emotive statement or a statement of feeling, you took something from me and I'm mad, so I yell stealing is wrong. But it's not scientifically verifiable. And so that was unsatisfying to most people who wanted to do something in an ethical way. And finally, really the biggest of all the problems with the logical positivists is their basic position, their most basic assertion is that all propositions are either analytic or synthetic, that fork they borrowed from David Hume, or they are meaningless. Now, what about that statement? When you say all propositions are either analytic or synthetic or they are meaningless, is that statement an analytic statement or a synthetic statement? And the logical positivists themselves couldn't agree on what kind of statement their own basic statement was. In fact, Ludwig Wittgenstein, one of the men they admired the most, said the basic statement of the logical positivists ultimately is a meaningless statement. And it kind of ended up that way. We turn to Ludwig Wittgenstein, who's probably the most famous of this whole bunch other than Bertrand Russell. Highly influential as an influence on the logical positivists, even though he never really supported their agenda, but they liked some of his early work. And more importantly, he became one of the pioneers of what we call ordinary language philosophy, and I'll say a little bit more about that here in a moment. The language philosophy of Wittgenstein is really where his philosophy ends up in his later life, his later career. His first work, the Logico Tractatus Philosophicus, I'm not sure if I'm even getting the name right, but it was a series of propositions of things we can say about the world. And they were pretty basic, straightforward statements, the kinds of things that we can know based on observation, and that's the thing that the logical positivists liked. But Wittgenstein always said that, this is the kind of stuff about which we can make clear and precise statements, and the things about which we can't make clear and precise statements sort of remain in silence. But there were hints in that early work of his that those things that he said almost needed to remain in silence were the things that intrigued him the most, the things that sort of defied being able to make a clear, precise statement about it. Some of the grander metaphysical sort of things that we've talked about before. What is the meaning of justice? What is the meaning of love? What is the meaning of truth? And so those things did have an allure for Wittgenstein, and not at all for the logical positivists, and that's where they tended to part company. Wittgenstein's later work, something that's known as the Philosophical Investigations, was actually just notes that he more or less scribbled while he was a prisoner of war. I take that back. I think that's the other treatise. But the Philosophical Investigations is notes from his later career when he was teaching philosophy and was moving in different directions. Not really publishing, but his students published these notes after his death, in which Wittgenstein really gets into this theory of how language works and the games that we play with language, and where the logical positivists were so intent on finding a precision to language that would always mean exactly the same thing. Every time someone used a word or a phrase, you'd know exactly what they meant by that phrase. Wittgenstein recognized that language doesn't work that way at all. That language is full of tricks and surprises and detours and breaking of rules that make it interesting. That we play language according to certain rules of the game, and yet at the same time, sometimes breaking those rules of the game are what make it more fun. Wittgenstein used various analogies for the way that he found language to work. He said words are like tools in a toolbox, and the same as you might take different tools out of a toolbox and use them for multiple purposes. You might use the same pliers to accomplish several different chores. You can use words in different ways to accomplish different chores. And so one of the famous lines by Wittgenstein is, the only way you really know what words mean is that the meaning of a word is always its use in the language. This is something that actually, if you remember back in symbolics class, we talked about even with religious vocabulary. You can't just assume that because you see a word in a sentence, it means exactly what it meant the last time you saw it in another sentence. Words always have meaning in their surrounding context. Wittgenstein used the example of chess play as a way of describing how language works in that mode. That if you don't understand the rules of chess and you see people playing chess, the way that they're moving pieces around the board is befuddling to you, and you don't understand why they're doing it that way. Or a similar example, if you don't understand the game of soccer and you come and stand on the sidelines of a soccer match and you hear someone shouting, offside, offside, you don't have any idea what offside means or why they're shouting it. But when you're in the game and you know how the game is played, those words have meaning and function and value as long as you use them in a way that works. In his coverage in this particular textbook, Donald Palmer tells a story about understanding that words are like tools, the way that Wittgenstein said, and you have to use the tool in the right way at the right time. For instance, you've got a couple of guys on a road trip together, and they wanted to get where they were going before sundown, and they're not there yet. They got an hour to go, and the sun is going down, and the driver says to the passenger, we're not going to make it. Look, the sun is going down already. And what if the passenger responded to that by saying, no, you shouldn't say the sun is going down. You should say that the world is turning on its axis and it gives us the illusion that that the sun is going down. In that context, that would be a meaningless statement. It doesn't get any job done. It's not accomplishing a meaningful task to their purpose at that point in time. It might have meaning in a different context if you were talking in some sort of heliocentric science theory class, but in that conversation it didn't have any use or validity. Or, Palmer tells a story, what if in that same road trip the passenger opened the glove box and found a hammer in the glove compartment and started hitting the driver over the head with the hammer? And the driver would say, what are you doing? And the passenger says, well, it's a hammer. Hammers are made for hitting, and so I'm hitting you with it. You have to use tools in the right way at the right time to have them work, and that's what Wittgenstein says is how language works. I have my own little story, my Wittgensteinian language story. This comes from when my daughter was playing in something called the Crow River Area Youth Orchestra up in Hutchinson, Minnesota. We would travel up there on Sunday afternoons. She would practice, and they would practice for several weeks, and then they were going to put on a concert at the end of the time. Try to make the build-up to the story short. All of us as parents took turns bringing snacks for each of those rehearsal dates, and this was our turn to bring snacks. My wife had been tied up all through the weekend and had not had time to get at anything, so it was Sunday. It was time for us to get going. I was in charge of preparing some sort of snack, so my daughter and I were in the kitchen, and we were taking graham crackers and slathering them with frosting and smushing them together, and this was going to be the snack that we brought to the orchestra. My wife was aghast when she saw us walking out the door with these. How can you bring such a terrible, tacky thing to this orchestra piece? Didn't matter, it was time to go, we went. We get to the place, and the kids would go into their rehearsal for an hour, they would take a break, and then come to the snack room, and then go back to rehearsal for another hour. So we get the snacks, I'm setting them out in the break room, the percussion guys come in the room first. These are all like upper grade school and high school kids, and the percussion guys all think they're pretty cool. You know, they're these tough guys. And they don't have much to practice in their sectional group, so they were done practicing first. First ones in the room, you know, they're the percussion guys. And they see the table with stacks of graham crackers with frosting in them. And the first guy in line from the percussionist sees this stack, and his eyes lit up, and he, looking at the rest of the guys and looking at me, he just erupted, and he said, "Oh, is that frosting? Solid!" I had never heard the word solid used in that context before in my life, but I knew exactly what he meant when he said it. There's really nothing all that solid about frosting. It's mostly squishy and it kind of mushes between your fingers. But in the context, you knew he was expressing his delight that this was something fabulous, that this was like the best snack he could ever possibly have. It's a language game, is what Wittgenstein says. And the way that language functions is by just expressing delightful things in ways that communicate, whether they follow the rules that some dictionary set down or not. And that's how we've understood language to function in 20th century thought, and you see people playing with it mightily. Wittgenstein's favorite book was Alice in Wonderland because it did much of that same sort of language play. You see that understanding of language in his work and the writing of other 20th century thinkers as well. That's the end of our lecture. Thank you.